everyone, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. I told you this was going to be a great year, and I have had some amazing guests already, and today is no exception. I met the gentleman who is the star of today's show last year. Met this man who has the most incredible story, and not all of us know his story, primarily because he's been around for so long, almost 100 years. Yes, I have an icon in the business community with us today. Let me tell you about him. He is George E. Johnson, a pioneer and businessman who is best known for his work in the hair care and cosmetic industries through the brand Johnson Products Company. This brand created Ultra Sheen and Afro Sheen. You know those hair care products way back when we were just moving into different parts of American culture and needed to make sure our hair was set, and he made sure that it was. After decades of personal and entrepreneurial growth, Mr. Johnson has chosen to gift all of us with his memoir. It is called Afro Sheen: How I Revolutionized an Industry with the Golden Rule, from Soul Train to Wall Street. And this book details his story and what led to his impressive success. So we have him, and we also have his co-writer, Hilary Beard, joining us. She, too, is a force to be reckoned with. Hilary is a two-time NAACP Image Award-winning writer. She has written for Venus and Serena Williams, Angela Bassett, and so many other icons. Please help me give these two a warm welcome. Mr. Johnson, Hilary, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to be here.
I remember when we met, Mr. Johnson, and you had decided that you were going to tell your story. And this is after so many years. You started your business many moons ago, 1954, and decided at the very young age of 94 that you were going to write your story. Why? Why did you make that decision at that time?
Well, I have to tell you that from the time I retired, people were asking me when I was going to write my book. And I told everybody for about 30 years that I had no intention of writing a book. I don't like to talk about myself. And when I try to tell my story, and I think of all the blessings that the Lord has granted me and put me in the position that he put me into, I'm so grateful about it that I just start crying. Mm. And I didn't change that attitude until November 21st, 2021, on a Sunday morning. I was sitting in my chair, my comfortable chair in my family room, watching TV, and all of a sudden, my room became occluded. I got very warm. I tried to get up to see what was going on. I couldn't get out of the chair. And I clearly heard 5 words: "You must tell your story."
Wow.
I immediately, in my mind, made a 180-degree turn and started searching for a professional writer. And as the Lord has been with me all the time, within a week, I had the recommendation of a wonderful writer, Hilary Beard. And I invited Hilary to Chicago. She came in December, and she told me what I had to go through to write the book, which was tremendous.
A lot of work.
Right, a lot of work. But we had a good rapport. I felt her. And one thing I said when I was looking for a writer, that the writer had to be spiritual, smart, and hopefully Black. And I got all of them.
Isn't that something? So here's Hilary. And Hilary, well, you and I go back. I've known you as a writer for many, many, many years. And you have worked with a lot of great people, as I mentioned in the intro. When you got that call from Mr. Johnson, why did you say yes?
Oh my gosh. Well, It's not very often that you have the opportunity to sit at the feet of a 94-year-old he was at the time. And so I love elders. So that was just like, oh my goodness, what an opportunity. But also to sit at the feet of somebody who has been such a trailblazer in our community and has had such a tremendous impact. I certainly knew Ultra Sheen and Soul Train. I grew up on them. We all had it in our bathroom cabinet, and I knew Soul Train as well. And but I was astounded as I got to know him. Every time he opened his mouth, some other amazing thing would fall out of it, and he would just mention it as though it were a thing in passing. And after a while, I started to say, this man is like the Forrest Gump of African American history. He's been everywhere. He knows everybody. He's seen everything that is so amazing during an era of my life where so much was happening. And so I became astounded by the impact that one man could have, not just his products and his company, but upon the workforce, the work environment in Chicago for Black people, benefits, a best place to work, sending 1,000 scholars to college, funding the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. King, starting a bank, all these amazing achievements that he had. So it was an amazing experience and a blessing and an honor.
That's something. So, Mr. Johnson, you certainly have done a lot of things. And we recently celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I remember marching in 1983. I was in Washington, D.C. I went to Howard there, and I remember marching for his holiday so that we could get his holiday. And so we certainly have it now. You knew Dr. King. Tell us how, and he came to your facility. How did that happen?
Well, we built a new facility in Chicago, right on the Dan Ryan Expressway. I wanted to take advantage of that site because I knew that if we put the building that I intended to put there, that it would be impossible for the community not to see it. And to know that a Black person had built that would be of great inspiration, I thought, to people that saw the building. And when Dr. King called me, he asked me to have a meeting with him. And we set a date for November. I had just moved in. We had just moved into the new facility about 2 months earlier. And so when he called me, I told him absolutely I'd like to talk to him if he wanted to talk to me. And he came to the building, and when he parked his car, he could see the entrance of the building. He could see all the plaza that we had built with pyramids, with 6-foot pyramids, and a big sculpture, 11-foot sculpture by a Black sculptor, Richard Hunt. And when he came into the entrance, and it was very novel, never been done before. Anyway, when he came in, and he got in the door, he had 3 people with him, and he observed from the landing the second floor and the first floor, and he told the people with him. He said, "Now this is Black power." And that was a great compliment to us. And anyway, we had a nice luncheon, and when we got to sit down to talk, my right arm and assistant to the president, Edwin C. Berry, joined us, and he said to me that I would like you to use your business to help us in the civil rights movement. And oh, by the way, he also brought everybody up to date on where the civil rights movement was at that time. Anyway, I told him absolutely I'm willing to help him. And what he wanted me to do was get as many Black businessmen as I could, because he wanted to introduce a new program in Chicago that had been very successful in Philadelphia. And he called that program Operation Breadbasket.
Right.
Um, I didn't know what Operation Basket would be, but I listened to it. Anyway, I got the men together. I got quite a few black people, business people together. And he came back and explained to all of us what he expected Operation Breadbasket to do. And and introduced Jesse Jackson, whom I had just met and had about a 6-hour conversation with him a month earlier. And
how old was Jesse Jackson at that point?
24 years old. 24 years old. I met Jesse I think, in the early part of October, walking down the quadrangle at the University of Chicago. And I heard this voice as I passed the chapel. And I stopped. I told my wife, let's listen to this. And I listened for about 5 minutes. Then I stepped inside and I asked the lady that was sitting close, who is this? And she just said, Jesse Jackson. He's in the civil rights movement. And I said, my goodness, I got to find that guy. Anyway, make a long story short.
That's a wonderful story. And isn't it true? The businessmen who you got together, at this point, you were part of the first Black Bank of Chicago. And you were able to get them to make donations so that Operation Breadbasket and the whole effort that Dr. King was working on would be funded. He would be able to make payroll. Is that right?
Well, yeah, that's another story too. Certainly we got to get, the object was to get these Black businessmen to support the program.
Yes.
And supporting the program means using your efforts, but also your money. And right away, he got Johnson Products Company's money, and it helped to get off the ground. But where was I?
No, that's a wonderful story, Mr. Johnson, and giving a perspective that many people don't know. You know, when we talk about civil rights, which is also part of politics, many people don't understand how the engine is fueled, and it's got to be with money. It's got boots on the ground, but also money, and that you were able to organize Black businessmen to help fund this critical effort, I think was absolutely essential. I want to ask Hilary, because one of the things that you have talked about is how much you learned in just talking to Mr. Johnson that kind of frames history. And I think this is important because we are at the feet of someone who has been on this planet almost 100 years. You have the most incredible perspective because of when you have lived, Mr. Johnson, when you have lived and what you have done. But as the person capturing your story and putting it in words, Hilary, could you just give us a sense of the span of things that you needed to learn in order to have the perspective necessary to support Mr. Johnson in his book?
Absolutely. This is the most wonderful project. So I went into it thinking that I had a pretty good command of African-American history, and I do. But I'd never worked with anybody who was 97 years old. Oftentimes when people write a memoir, they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And so you have to know kind of a limited span of history. But once I started working with Mr. Johnson, I'm like, okay, wait, I've got to go back 30 more years. So Mr. Johnson was born in 1927 in the Cotton South in Mississippi. He was part of the Great Migration North to Chicago. He landed in the Jim Crow North, in a mecca of the Jim Crow North. He was back and forth. He landed there at the onset of the Great Depression. He was back to the Jim Crow South. He lived through World War II era. He founded his company in 1954, the same year of Brown versus Board of Education, which many people say is the year that the civil rights movement kicked off. It was the beginning of the civil rights era. He grew his business during the 1960s, during the 1970s. He was involved in his business through the 1980s and worked well into until 1997. So the scope and the span, the arc of his life is just incredible. And so I had to go back and learn a lot of things learn more deeply a lot of things before that happened before the civil rights movement, including Black people's participation in the labor market and the Black labor movement. Mr. Johnson played a pivotal role in Chicago in creating jobs for Black people, and became one of the best places for Black people, the best place for Black people to work, the most desired place for Black people to work in Chicago in that era.
That's fantastic. And Mr. Johnson, just for context, and folks, by the way, as you read the book, and let me remind you, this is Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. We are talking to George Johnson and Hilary Beard. Mr. Johnson has written a memoir that just gives so much history and perspective and information about the empire that he built that supports Black people and our hair. And we know today in 2025, this is a booming industry. Mr. Johnson was a pioneer in this industry. But I want you to tell people, Mr. Johnson, why and how did you end up in hair care? Tell us that story, please.
Well, when I was 25 years old, well, first of all, I was working for a hair care company, and not only hair care and cosmetics, Mr. S.B. Fuller Products Company. And Mr. Fuller was a pioneer also, and my mentor. And he started his business in the middle of the Depression, 1936. And when I started with him, I was 1944. I was 25 years old. And I had to work two jobs. I worked for him, but I also had to have another job because I didn't make enough money working for him at that time.
And you had a wife and a baby at that point, right?
At that time, I had a wife, two children, a 2-year-old and a 2-month-old. I was working two jobs and washing cars on the weekend and had no future. What happened that took me to the cosmetic and to the hair care business is a chance meeting with a man as I was going to my second job. I got on the elevator to the 5th floor. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, and this well-dressed gentleman got on the elevator. But when I looked at him and the look on his face, I blurted out without thinking, "What the hell is wrong with you?" And he said to me, "Well, I own the house of Nelson. I'm Orville Nelson. And I came to see Mr. Fuller because this is a Black company, and the product I work for is giving me a lot of trouble. And I thought that maybe because it was a Black company, I could get this company to make me a better product or improve upon the product."
He was a barber, correct?
He was a barber. And doing a product, doing a process that was the rage in the country at the time. So I said to him, "I don't know what you're talking about, but I work in the lab. And if you give me your card," and he had one, he gave it to me. I said, "I'll come over and see if I can help you." I put that card in my dresser drawer. 2 months later, I picked it up and I went over to 64th and Cottage Grove, and I walked in the door. I was shocked. There was no place to sit. There was no place to stand. 4 chairs, and they were all filled. And these barbers their hands were moving so fast. I didn't know what the heck was going on. It looked like an emergency. And it kind of was, because the people they were working on began to make comments like, "Hey, hurry up, baby. It's getting warm. It's getting hot. I got to go." And he would turn that chair around and dump him in the shampoo. And as soon as that water hit his scalp, he said, "Oh." He had a big sigh and a lot of relief. So
because Mr. Johnson, the process was putting chemicals in the hair to straighten the hair, right?
Yes. And yeah. I asked Nelson to show me what he was using. And when I looked at it, it was in a gallon jug, 3 layers. The water was on the bottom, the solids in the middle, and the oil on the top. And I said, "Is this it?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, this stuff needs to be emulsified. How are you using it?" He said, well, I got a stick, and he stirs this in the gallon jug until he thinks it's mixed up, and then they take it out with a large comb and put it in a small jar, and then put it on the head of the customer. And they work real fast to get this hair straight to the point where they can finger wave it. Mm-hmm. And that would take some time. And then during that time, the active ingredient was sodium hydroxide. And the sodium hydroxide would become free as they moved along. And also would saponify the grease layer that they put on the scalp into itself. So that was nothing left. And that's why the patients were in a hurry to get the stuff out of their hair.
To burn.
Yes. Because it would burn and put blisters. And I said, it was dangerous.
Okay.
And I said, we got to do something about that. Make a long story short, took 8 months, maybe closer to 9 months, and a lot of samples that we made in Mr. Fuller's lab. And with each one, he would critique it and tell you it's too slow, it's too fast, it's too soupy or whatever. He had all kinds of comments to make. But one day he said, "This is it. Don't touch it. This is it." And immediately it popped in my head. I said, "Well, we ought to market this." And he said to me, "Well, what would it take to market it?" I said, $500 like that, because I knew I could borrow $250 for my share. And I knew he could get, in fact, he just wrote me a check for $250.
He had a booming business.
He had a booming business. And that $250 was put in the bank the next day. And that $500, because of the contacts that I had with suppliers at Fuller Products, glass companies, oil companies, all the ingredients that I needed, I was able to get not full orders, but portions. One guy got me a 50-gallon pail of petroleum from one of his customers, and a 5-gallon jug of mineral oil from the same customer. The guy that we sold glass to brought me 6 dozen glasses, and the minimum purchase is five gross. That's 5 dozen jars.
So your relationships helped you to.
I used all my relationships, and I knew I needed a vacuum filler. I found that. I got everything I needed, and I spent $499. And had $1 left.
Well,
but
that's
3 weeks later, that was $750 in the company. $750.
That's an amazing story, and that process that you were talking about, because you're talking about this was for men, and this was a time when we had Sammy Davis Jr. and Nat King Cole, and they were wearing that process. The hair was straightened and put into the finger wave. So Black men wanted to look like that. That's right?
And all of those entertainers were Orville Nelson's customers. When they came to Chicago, they went to his barbershop every time they lived. Plus, he was Nat King Cole's personal barber.
That's something. But so you didn't end up staying with him. There were some issues with his work ethic and your work ethic, but ultimately you pivoted also to women. Yeah. Why did you go from what was a fruitful beginning to working with women, which certainly ended up being exponentially bigger? Why did you do that?
Okay, I started out with barbers, and I put a lot of effort and money in teaching barbers how to use my product. After about 2 years of that, I began to find out that barbers were not loyal, to the point where the product that we made was a revolutionary product. We emulsified sodium hydroxide into a hair straightener, never been done in the world. And the barbers had not only a good success, but they made a lot more money. But when somebody came around with something cheaper, they would go for the cheaper stuff. And the cheaper stuff was a coattail rider of my formulation that others had, by whatever ways they got the formula. A lot of guys got the formula, and some close to the formula, not the real formula, but something close. And I think it started with people betraying Nelson, who worked for him. But anyway, after about 2 years, I realized that they were not that trustworthy or that loyal. But every time I went to a barber shop, I passed 2 beauty salons. So one day I thought about, well, I'm gonna stop in a beauty salon and see what's going on there and see what I can do in with hairdressers. And that's how Ultra Sheen and the Ultra Sheen relaxer came about.
And those products ended up being very important, especially at the time. So you started your business in 1954. What year did you start Ultra Sheen?
Ultra Sheen started in 1957.
Okay, so 1957, where this is the civil rights movement is kind of building steam, right? But also women and men are looking for other opportunities in the workplace, right? So Hilary, could you give us some perspective? What is going on in America as Mr. Johnson is building out these products?
Yes, absolutely. So we've already mentioned that Mr. Johnson started his company in 1954, which is the kickoff of the civil rights era. That's when Brown versus Board, the Supreme Court decision, was handed down. Also during the late 50s, we have the Montgomery bus boycott, the Selma to Montgomery March. As we move into 1960s, it's the Vietnam era, the March on Washington, which Mr. Johnson wasn't able to attend because he was working so hard. Then we move into the era of the historic civil rights legislation and housing legislation. During this time period, both Malcolm X and Dr. King were assassinated. As we move further into the 60s, it's the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, the Black Arts movement all came
Well,
into.
excuse me, Black Power movement. That's also when the dawn of the Afro, and then we get Afro Sheen.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yes. And so we're all familiar with the soundtrack of that era. We were listening to James Brown and Aretha and Nina Simone and Marvin Gaye and Sam Cooke, The Temptations, the early Jackson 5. So all of these things were happening through the 50s and 60s before we get to the 1970s.
That's important for context to understand that the evolution of Black culture and really Black empowerment was happening at the same time as you were filling a need, Mr. Johnson. That men and then later women are looking to have some liberation around their hair, especially as they began to work in more white environments where today natural hair is popular. It was not necessarily popular back then. Mr. Johnson, can you speak to the need that you saw that women had in particular during those early years?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I started investigating the hairdressers, first thing I recognized was that they were using a method that was founded by what's her name? Madam C.J. Walker.
Right.
Madam C.J. Walker created a hair straightening procedure where you use a hot comb and grease to pull the hair straight. But it was temporary, and it was vulnerable to excessive moisture. Excessive moisture would make the hair revert, or get caught in the rain, hair reverted, and people had to go back and forth quite often. What people really wanted, women really wanted, was something more permanent. They wanted a permanent, want the hair permanently straight, and that's what we delivered. we modified the men's product and made Afro Sheen relaxer for women. Women's hair we were able to straighten women's hair without any problem, without any discomfort or burns, because we reduced the alkalinity in the men's product to a point where women could have their hair straight no matter what the grade of hair was, and it was straight forever. The only thing that changed would be the new hair growth that they would have to do after they first got it straight. To maintain it is just straightening the new hair. Anyway, that was a godsend for women.
Yes.
And
it was revolutionary. I mean, this is what it's important for people to understand this, because you were doing it for so long, and now the Black hair care industry has every product you can imagine. But back then they did not. And this was a revolutionary product that really changed. It made it much easier for women to have flexibility with their hair. Let me remind folks, this is Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. We are speaking with Mr. George Johnson and his co-writer, Hilary Beard, about the new book, which is called Afro Sheen, How I Revolutionized an Industry with the Golden Rule, From Soul Train to Wall Street. And so let's address that for a minute, Mr. Johnson. This golden rule concept for a businessman. So we know you started your business very small, which most people do. You see the need. You are helping people solve the challenge of having more flexibility with their hair. But you write in your book about how all of it, your approach to business and to the success that you had, becoming a multi-million-dollar business, the first Black business to be traded on the New York Stock Exchange, exponential growth at an early stage in your business. You attribute it to the golden rule. Can you explain that to us?
Well, I was 17 years old when I went to work for Mr. Fuller. Mr. Fuller was quite a devout man. And I also have to tell you that in order to build his own business, Mr. Fuller would get people to come to work for him, and he would trust them to take about $40 or $50 worth of products and supply them with a container that they could carry to go out and sell to the people in the community. And every morning he had a meeting for about an hour to sometimes an hour and a half. And he spoke to people about the Spirit. Most of his well, they weren't sermons. Most of his meetings were grounded in the Bible. And I was 17 years old, and I'm listening to this, and I was a salesman too. And he got me to start reading the Bible at 17 years old. And reading the Bible and listening to Mr. Fuller, I learned, because Mr. Fuller loved the golden rule. He founded his business on that too. And so I had that foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And when the Lord helped me to get this business going, it was just natural for me to use the golden rule. And the golden rule is so powerful. It's grounded in love. And I like people. And it was easy for me to think that way. So I didn't do anything that I wouldn't want to put people to do for me or do to me. And I help people. And
that's a very different perspective. We live in a capitalist culture where making money is often number one. And it doesn't sound like you put making money as number one. It was serving people that was number one for you.
Absolutely. And
I'd like to ask Hilary to give us a little bit of perspective, because there's so many things that you did in your business that did put the people first, that did honor the people. Can you just go through, you have a little laundry list over there. Can you give us a sense of some of these things that Mr. Johnson did?
I love running down his brag sheet. So these are just a few things. Mr. Johnson, from the beginning, it was very important to him to treat every transaction or every customer with the golden rule. So he paid attention to his business relationship by relationship, customer by customer, client by client, barber, hairdresser. He paid a lot of attention to the relationship. On the hairdressing side, he immediately started trying to solve problems. So he already described to you the issue around hair texture and accessing the workplace. But in addition to that, there was a problem with smoke from burning the hair and burning the grease. There was a problem with smoke that he was trying to solve in the workplace. Once he got his business up and running, it wasn't soon after that he began to offer profit sharing for all of his workers, not just the leaders, not just management, but all of his workers, including the laborers out in the manufacturing plant. He offered many benefits that today people are still fighting for. So he had healthcare benefits for his employees. He had medical care available at the plant. He had a subsidized cafeteria where people could eat good food because he wanted people to take as much of their paycheck as possible home with them. There was also a problem with hunger in Chicago at that point in time, and that was a way of addressing it. They gave away turkeys at Christmas. They had tuition reimbursement long before the government reimbursed a company for tuition reimbursement. There was paid maternity leave for women and returning to your job. I could go on and on with the benefits that he offered in the workplace. In addition to that, through his educational foundation, Mr. Johnson provided scholarships to 1,000 deserving Black and Brown students, most of them Black, in an era where Black people were just being able to access college beyond HBCUs because most schools would not permit Black people to come to the schools except for HBCUs. And then through his philanthropic fund, he made significant contributions to the cultural, the civic, and civil rights organizations in Chicago and nationwide. He was the head of the board of the National Urban League in Chicago. He made significant contributions to the NAACP, the UNCF, and I could go on and on. So this man had a tremendous impact upon Black America and Black Chicago, helping many Black people move from being low-income people who could only access, and I don't say this to disparage this type of work, but we were limited to often dirty jobs, dangerous jobs, menial labor. Many women were confined to doing domestic work for white families, but had higher aspirations. And much greater potential. And Mr. Johnson created a loving work environment where people could fulfill their potential and create a great product and get it out to the world.
Well, amen to that. Thank you for explaining that, Hilary. Mr. Johnson, you started your company small, with your family. Your family helped you to build this company, but it grew pretty fast. Within 15 years, you went public. That is, I'm sure, considered fast. To what do you attribute the growth? Why did it grow so quickly? What were you doing to make it blossom in that way?
Well, first of all, I as I said, we feel the need that Black women and Black men, well, let's talk about women. We feel the need that Black women had for decades. And that is when we created the Afro Sheen relaxer. And that grew because it was so needed. And that is what really built the company. But in 1970, I met Don Cornelius. And Don Cornelius had a show copied after Bandstand that Dick Clark was airing out of Philadelphia. Excuse me. And I saw this show. I liked the show. I had been looking for a way to have for JPC, for Johnson Products Company's products to get on television. I had made a couple of efforts that didn't turn out well. So I was very anxious to find out if this could work. And I had a 30-minute pilot made in color. And when I saw this 30-minute pilot, I said, I'll take a risk on this. And what we did, my lawyers formed a LLC company, and I gave Don, although he had no money to invest, I gave Don 50%, and Johnson Products Company owned 50%. And that's how we got started together.
And so, Mr. Johnson, from that start, were you already public when you met Don Cornelius?
Yes.
So what year did you go public?
In 69, I met him in 70.
So you go public in 69, just for context.
Mm-hmm.
What was your company worth when you went public?
That's a good question. I can give you an example. I really couldn't tell you today I can't remember that.
Okay, that's okay.
But what I can tell you is that when I went, after about a year after going public, my financial statement said $105 million.
Oh,
and that was because of the price of my stock. And
then after you started working with Don Cornelius, so already you go public and your stock blossoms, and then you create with Don Cornelius Soul Train, and this is where the ads for your hair care products are now showing every week on this show that becomes popular very quickly.
Right.
How much did your company grow from when you started Soul Train?
Okay, let me tell you, we had Don, and I split. Don had 3 minutes to sell, 6 minutes and an hour program. And Don so we gave Don 3 minutes, and we used the 3 minutes we could use for our products. And we started in 71. Soul Train started October of 71. We ended October of 70. We ended 71 at about 11.2 million. In 5 years, from 71 to 75, the company grew from 11.2 million to 37 million in 1975.
That's rapid growth.
Yeah.
And so this is the power of marketing and the power of television. So this is another thing. So TV obviously had been around for a while, but you talked about black and white. People don't even know what that means now. Black and white TV, what are you talking about? So you were going from black and white television to color television, showing these beautiful brown-skinned women with all different hair textures. I mean, you also worked with a number of advertising agencies, Black advertising agencies, to create these representations. Is that right?
Yes, we did. First, when I first started in business, there weren't any Black advertising agencies, so I had to use white advertising agencies. But Vince Cullors, who was the director at Johnson Publishing for Ebony, left Johnson Publishing and started his advertising agency. I was his first customer, and Vince was a very bright guy. He was a tremendous artist, and he had the same philosophy I had. We didn't want the Amos and Andy thing. We didn't want the what you call you know what I'm talking about, the Amos and Andy, and then the Ben, Uncle Ben
and Aunt Jemima, yeah.
So he did some very, very good ads for me, and and got a lot of attention. He was a little bit difficult to get along with, and
Natives can be.
yeah, he was. So when Tom Burrell
Yeah.
started his agency, I went to Tom Burrell, and I have to say, Vince was a great guy. He gave me some great ads, but Tom Burrell really did it for JPC.
Yeah, he was a genius. I mean, and built a huge business
Oh
in
my God,
Chicago.
yes.
Let me remind folks, this is Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. We are getting a history lesson here today, and it is so wonderful. We're talking to Mr. George Johnson, who has written his first memoir. It is called Afro Sheen, How I Revolutionized an Industry with the Golden Rule, from Soul Train to Wall Street. There's so much information in your book, Mr. Johnson, and I'm going to bring Hilary in again for a moment. I just want a little bit more context about the timing. So, Mr. Johnson, explain what happens with TV and marketing his product on Soul Train to exactly the audience who he wants to reach. But what was happening in the early 70s that made this a ripe time for Johnson Products Company to flourish the way that it did?
Yes, really wonderful question. So around this time in the early 70s, Essence magazine was being published for the first time. As a matter of fact, Mr. Johnson was one of Essence's first advertisers, and he bought several pages of ads for several years to help Essence get over the hump and get started. Black Enterprise was starting as well, and Black folks were particularly after the death of Martin Luther King and the rebellion afterwards, corporate America started paying attention to the needs of Black people a little bit more, and Black people slowly began accessing professional jobs. In about 1970, only about 5% of Black folks had professional jobs, but there was movement occurring in that direction. And white businesses were beginning to open their doors to Black people, although white folks were not reciprocating and shopping with us. But there was a lot going on in African-American culture, and Mr. Johnson, with Afro Sheen now, we've moved from Ultra Sheen, and now folks are taking pride in their appearance. And Dr. King had spoken, and others had spoken words like, you should be proud of how God made you, and your hair the way it naturally came out of your head. And so people like Angela Davis and Kathleen Cleaver and Huey P. Newton were all wearing big afros. And Mr. Johnson and Johnson.
And Don Cornelius.
And Don Cornelius. Oh, we can't forget Don Cornelius. I think you have a Don Cornelius afro story, right?
So wait, because we only have a few minutes left, but Mr. Johnson, please tell us, because you as a businessman, here you are, with your suit and tie and crisp white shirt. Tell us about when you met Don Cornelius. Who was the person that you saw?
Well, when I met Don Cornelius, I could hardly keep from laughing in his face. Don had an afro out like this. He had on a long red coat, a long red coat with huge collars, and he had boots that came up over his knees.
And this red coat with leather, was it not?
Leather red coat. I mean, I said, what in the heck is this? Until I started talking to him. I mean, anyway, that was my impression. I really almost howled when I saw him. But Don was a smart guy. Don knew how to draw attention. Don was he was a disc jockey. He had been a disc jockey. He also worked for a big Black radio station. So he had the equipment. He had what it takes. So when we started,
and this was a great partnership. Business meets creativity, and look at the magic that you all made. I have one very quick question because we're out of time, but I have to ask you this because of the news, this big article that came out in the New York Times about the negative impact that relaxers have had on Black women and children. There was a report suggesting that they could create cancer. What do you know about this, and does it have any relationship to the products that you made at JPC?
Not at all. The products that I produced, the active ingredient was sodium hydroxide. Sodium, hydro- Sodium hydroxide has never been declared a carcinogen. That's my answer. And so it's not, it doesn't affect our formula or our products. I have nothing to do with what other people have added to that formulation, but our formulation had no effect like that, as far as I know. But again, the sodium hydroxide is not a carcinogen.
Well, thank you for answering that. Of course, people are very concerned, and whatever the products are that have carcinogens in them, we hope they are now off the market. Mr. Johnson, congratulations on your book. It's quite a good read. Hilary Beard, thank you for sharing some history with us. It is a gift that you've given to the community for us to learn some history and understand what a pioneer you were with your family, building this business and taking care of people along the way. So thank you so much for being a guest with us on Dreamleapers. We appreciate you.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Hilary. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. I told you you were going to want to learn about this. Mr. Johnson's book is called Afro Sheen, How I Revolutionized an Industry with the Golden Rule, From Soul Train to Wall Street. Take a read. It's really good. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.